The objective of this lesson is to gain an understanding of the attribute of volume and relate volume to multiplication and to addition. Let's look at some vocabulary before we get started. Polyhedron, a three-dimensional shape with plane faces. Volume, the amount of space occupied by a three-dimensional object measured in cubic units. A three-dimensional object has length, width, and height. Rectangular prism is a polyhedron with two or more identical rectangular bases. Unit cube, a cube that measures 1 unit in length, 1 unit in width, and 1 unit in height. In 3rd and 4th grade, students learned how much liquid it takes to fill a container. They poured units of measure into a space to measure volume. Volume of solids is measured by how many unit cubes it takes to fill up a three-dimensional space with no gaps and no overlaps. So now we will be packing units of measure using unit cubes. 5th grade students work exclusively with rectangular prisms that have whole number side lengths. In figuring out the volume of a rectangular prism, attention is given to the height of the unit in addition to its length and width. Once a layer of unit cubes has been packed and counted, another layer is added. This process is repeated until the rectangular prism has been filled with unit cubes. If students don't have a deep understanding of what formulas or equations really mean, it's difficult to memorize and apply them when needed. After they have packed one layer, they may find it more efficient to count how many layers will be needed to fill the prism and add them together. If in the first layer there are 12 unit cubes and it will take 3 layers to fill a prism, they could add 12 plus 12 plus 12 to find the volume of 36 cubic units. They might discover that instead of adding 12 3 times, it is more efficient to multiply 12 times 3. So, volume equals base times height. They might also discover that the first layer was 4 cubes by 3 cubes, which equals 12 cubes. This could lead them into the discovery of volume equals length times width times height. The use of these formulas comes after the extensive process of packing and experimenting before the formulas or equations are introduced. The objective of this lesson was to gain an understanding of the attribute of volume and relate volume to multiplication and addition. In this lesson, the meaning of volume was introduced and explained. After extensive practice, the formulas volume equals base times height and volume equals length times width times height was mentioned. The importance of hands-on manipulatives and complete understandings before formulas are introduced was stressed. The relationship between volume and multiplication and addition was established.
The amount of information the brain retains depends partially on when that information was presented. People tend to remember best what comes first and remember second best what comes last. What comes just past the middle of the learning period is what is remembered least. This happens because the first items of new information are within the working memory's functional capacity, so they command attention and are likely to be retained in semantic memory. The information that is received later exceeds the working memory's functional capacity and is lost. As the learning period concludes, information in the working memory are already stored or chunked, which allows for additional processing of final information. Due to this information, new material should be taught first during what is called prime time 1, because it is most likely to be remembered then.
Primetime design is a concept that comes from a book written by David Sousa. The idea behind it is that what we learn first in a lesson is what we learn the best. So you have this first set of prime time, which is when you first start the lesson. You get the information out there to kids. You want them to have accurate information. Anything that's new information goes to the kids at that time. The important part is that we hit the most important things first, and that as the instructor, we're the ones giving the kids the most accurate, new information. The one thing that you don't want to do during primetime 1 is to throw out questions to the kids. Well, what do you know about something or other? And then have the kids respond back with all these wild ideas, because in this primetime 1, that's a time when what is said will be learned. And so if kids throw those wild ideas out there, that's what they remember instead of remembering the accurate information, accurate new information.
New material taught should be followed by a period of practice and review during what is called downtime. During this time, the information is no longer new, and practice helps the learner organize it for further processing. Practice allows the learner to use newly learned skills in a new situation so that it will be correctly remembered. Teachers should monitor students' early practice to ensure that it is accurate and provide timely feedback and correction if needed. Practice should take place in short, intense periods of time. New learning should be practiced frequently at first so that it is quickly organized. If we expect students to retain the information in active storage and to remember how to use it accurately, it should continue to be practiced over increasingly longer time intervals.
Downtime's an interesting thing because the brain research tells us that kids need time to practice. Whatever the skill or the concept, the idea, kids would be using that in some way. Downtime can also be something that is just a short little stand-up break. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes. We're going to talk about this thing, and then I'm going to have you stand up and you're going to find somebody else in the room and you're just going to chat with them about what you heard. And you have to do this while you're standing up.
Closure should take place during what is called prime time 2. This is the second most powerful learning position and an important opportunity for the learner to determine sense and meaning. Closure is not the same as a lesson review or summary. Review should happen during downtime of instruction. Reviewing before closure increases the chance that the closure is accurate.
There's nothing wrong with review, but review without closure has very little effect on retention for our brains. So the difference between review and closure is that in review, the teacher is doing most of the work, whereas in closure, the student's brain is doing most of the work. So in a closure activity, I would have students be explaining to each other or in small groups, teaching each other the concepts, the ideas, and whatever other knowledge or skill that they were supposed to get out of that learning episode. According to the research, the 20-minute lesson segment is really the most effective in terms of moving things from working memory to long-term memory because there is the least amount of downtime in the middle. There is not necessarily one best fits everybody because we know that younger kids probably need shorter segments, and as kids get older they can sit through a little bit longer segments. But 20 minutes really is the standard in brain research of how long a kid or even an adult can sit still and learn about something without doing something with it.
We struggle to make decisions when trying to process a lot of opposing ideas in our head. So why don't you start by actually writing down the pros and cons of taking the new job?
But Prof, what do I do now? I have the same number of pros and cons, and they all look important.
Yes, that's one of the limitations of Franklin's pro-con method. As you can imagine, decision sciences have advanced a little over the last 250 years. Dr. Ellie Goldratt, author of The Goal and creator of Theory of Constraints, developed the change matrix to help overcome this limitation.
How does this method work?
It builds on Franklin's method by asking us to consider the pros and cons of not changing. This provides additional insight for either making a good decision or better understanding the causes of a bad decision.
Okay, but aren't they just opposites of each other?
Not necessarily. To clearly differentiate the four assumptions or forces that impact our decisions, Goldratt used a simple story. Suppose you're standing at the base of a mountain, and you have to decide whether or not to climb it. Climbing the mountain represents the change we are considering. On top of the mountain is a pot of gold. This represents our assumption about the pros or future upside of making a change.
So what are the cons, or future downside?
Climbing up the mountain takes a lot of effort and can be quite risky. You may fall down and break your legs, or even your neck. The effort or cost of making the change and the risk of failing is represented by two crutches.
What represents our assumptions about the pros and cons of not changing?
An alligator swimming towards us at the base of a mountain represents the current downside of not changing. If we don't run up the mountain, we'll be eaten. And the longer we wait, the bigger the risk.
I suppose my alligators would be the disharmony I have with my coworkers, and that I sometimes take these frustrations home. And what represents the upside of not changing?
The positive of the status quo is represented by a mermaid. She represents what we're afraid to lose if we change, because we can't take her with us up the mountain. So Jason, what are you afraid to give up? What's your mermaid?
You know, I do love my current job, and working so close to home I get to spend more time with my kids each day. Also, I hate failing. If I quit my job, I'll feel like a failure.